Good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're watching this. Hello, everybody. This is Professor Mitchell coming to you with Psych 201 Lifespan Development. Today, we're going to be talking about adolescence. And this is that big transitional period where individuals transition from childhood into the stage right before early adulthood. So we're not considering them adults, but in a lot of ways, if we look at this from a model or a paradigm perspective, they are adults. From the psychosexual perspective, adolescence is the point in which they hit sexual maturation. They're able to make some cognitive decisions that they weren't able to make before, but they're not fully adult yet. Behaviorally, they're going to be doing things without the oversight of another adult. So adolescence to me is a lot like an internship. We're not ready to let you go out there and actually do the career path that you're ready for. You may academically know, you may have all the information that you need, but you're just not ready to go out there and do it without somebody overseeing you. And that's what adolescence is to me. It's the internship or the practicum where if you make mistakes, and you will make mistakes as an adolescent, hopefully they'll be transitive mistakes. And what I mean by that is they get caught. These mistakes or thinking errors or behavioral errors get caught before the full-on ramifications come about from them. Okay? Does that always happen? Absolutely not. So if we look at this from a psychosocial perspective, we're going to see that sometimes adolescents do things very adult. And again, a lot of that has to do with the transitive nature of adolescence, where there's parts of the body, parts of the psyche, parts of the emotional development that are very adult-like, and there's still some that are very immature. And we have to realize that from a neurocognitive perspective, the frontal lobe is far from being developed. The emotions are far from being set. The personality is not what it's going to be as an adult. So we have to be very careful with what we see with these children. So let's begin by looking at what it means to be adolescents. If we look at this historically, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with historical because it doesn't really help us today, but it does help us to somewhat understand that children are not much different than they were 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Yes, adolescence is happening at a sooner time frame in a lot of situations, but if we look at adolescence as just not necessarily a point in time in a person's life, but in a transitional phase, it's the same thing. And if you look back, say even 100 years ago, adolescence began much later than it does today. It began around the age of 15, and it was a very trying time for that young person, but then they would transition to be an adult. Adolescence today can last upwards of 10 or 12 years. For some people, it doesn't last that long, and we have to be very careful when we're looking at this because, again, as I've said with all my lectures with lifespan development, we look at this from a very Western-centric lens or viewpoint, and that even is a bit misleading because you have to remember that if we look at the United States as a Western-centric grouping of people, population, it's not heterogeneous. So when we have new immigrants who come in and new cultures who come in, they're still going to have their own ways that either are going to acclimate to the Western culture or they're going to stay the same. And so some of these cultures are going to see that, what we consider to be adolescence is well into their adulthood. So we are looking at this from a very narrow perspective, but this is also the way that it's kind of been. And I'm not arguing that because it has been this way for a long time, it has to remain that way. But what we have to realize is that this is how the social and behavioral sciences work. We work with what we've had in the past, and we look to try to project that into the future. And as I will say in almost all my lectures, especially lifespan development and human sexuality, which are very similar in a lot of the things that we go over, we're always, as scientists, as developmental psychologists, as sexologists, we're going to be behind the culture, because the culture can just make a decision as to what they want. They want to change the verbiage. They want to change how we call someone, or where we consider. The best example of this is in 2019 is gender, and how society wants to portray gender versus how sexology portrays gender. And sexology can't just keep up with culture, because we would simply be not even close to being a science if we did that. Okay, so off of my soapbox here of trying to set the stage here, some of these things may sound a little bit less than politically correct, but this is where the science is today. Okay, and so we also will look at a separate period called emerging adulthood, and that is really another transitive state. Adolescence is, I'm moving from a child into a sometimes physical adult with childlike emotions and cognitions. Emerging adulthood is same adult body, more adult responsibility, but sometimes lacking in the emotional and cognitive and behavioral stability that we would expect from someone in adulthood or middle adulthood. So when we look at the term puberty, we're looking at a biological change in an individual. So time between the onrush of hormones and full adult physical development. So it's that moment for girls. It's usually the time frame that we call the onset of puberty would be menarche, which is the first time that a young lady gets her first menstruation or period. For boys, it's not as indicative. Usually, and this is not scientific to be certain, but we can kind of see and smell with young boys when they've hit puberty. If anybody has been to a middle school or even a junior high or a late elementary school, my first clinical experience was working with that age group, that middle school, young high school group, and I always remember thinking one of the psychosocial things that I always tried to talk to my young men about was, Axe body spray on top of funk is still funk, and so. That's you can kind of almost, this sounds a little crass, but you can smell in young men when, and young girls as well, you can smell and see with, changes in body hair, changes in voice, changes in, sometimes there's acne or different, and growth spurts. You can kind of see, smell, that they're going through puberty. Menarche, again, is around the age of 12.5 years for normal weight girls. We tend to see, that this number has actually come down a bit. It is not uncommon to see 10 or 11, and it's actually not in the abnormal world to see something under 10 for young girls. At this point, we have, for the girl, she has her first ovulation, her first menstrual period, and pregnancy is biologically possible, but everything is not in complete synchronicity, as it will, for some females moving forward. Spermarchy is basically the male equivalent, and it's the boy's first ejaculation of sperm, or the possibility that there could be ejaculation of sperm. There may not be ejaculation, the day or the week when it's actually possible, but a lot of times this will happen involuntarily during sleep, or just kind of not in an expected way. And so this is the first time where there's ejaculation of sperm. This is around 13, maybe a little bit younger nowadays, and there's some things, there's some research to say that could be because of the types of diets that we're having, hormones that are being introduced, but the number is going down below 13 as the normal, and it's not abnormal to see it happen before then or slightly after. For some young men and some young ladies, it will happen later, and that has a lot to do with body type, has a lot to do with weight to height ratio or BMI. There's a lot of different factors that are going to come into that. The hormones are the body chemicals that are produced by the male and female body to regulate the biological processes. These hormones are going to influence a lot of what we see in adolescence and adulthood. We tend to see a lot of fluctuation in thoughts, cognitions, emotions, behavior in adolescence because there's a huge influx in hormones, and the hormones are not quite regulated with consciousness and with cognition. So why we see this emotional change within boys and girls during puberty is that they're getting a rush of these hormones that they just haven't experienced, and they haven't had to deal with the cognitive or conscious aspect of being more emotional, but trying to compensate that with thoughts and behavior. So as we've talked a little bit about, cognitive behavioral therapy is all about, your thoughts creating maladaptive behaviors, or maladaptive behaviors creating thoughts. Well, we throw in a third thing here with adolescence, and that's hormones. And those hormones are the naturally occurring things that are possibly, I don't want to use the word cause, but are highly correlated with changes and differences in not only normal development, but also psychopathology. So during puberty, we see that there's a lot of glandular activity that leads to these hormones being produced in abundance, or possibly sometimes not being produced enough. One of the major glands is the pituitary gland, and this is the gland that responds to a signal from the hypothalamus to produce a lot of the different hormones that children, adolescents will respond to, as well as adults. But these regulate growth and control of other glands. So the pituitary gland is very important because it's controlling other glands, such as adrenal and sex glands. So during adolescence, when the pituitary gland is really kicking in, the adrenal system is being activated much more frequently and much more with higher amounts of hormones. And these adrenal glands will produce the stress hormones, such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. And a lot of older research is starting to show, and this is kind of an aside, but I've listened to a lot of different lectures from psychiatrists who have been proposing a radical redefinition of what we consider to be ADHD today, and also the treatment for this in adolescence. And one of the things that they've been pushing, and pushing is kind of a bad term, but they've been advocating is using alpha and beta blockers rather than psychostimulants for ADHD. By no stretch of the imagination am I recommending any type of medication or any type of medical intervention. I'm just stating what some psychiatrists have said in lectures that I've listened to, as well as conferences that I've been to. But they're looking at these old school medications, alpha and beta blockers, specifically beta blockers, as a means of trying to downshift epinephrine and norepinephrine, because their theory is that these ADHD symptoms are actually being triggered by adrenaline rather than kind of the frontal lobe and consciousness and mind, kind of the interplay that the psychostimulants are affecting. So if you're interested in ADHD in adolescence, that's one thing that doesn't get a lot of play in the medical establishment, primarily because there's not a lot of interest in researching old drugs. Again, a little bit of a soapbox thing here, but alpha and beta blockers are not new. They're not anything that you can put a patent on. There's nothing that you can't really make a ton of money. So not a conspiracy theory, just simple truth. The pharmaceutical companies don't really have a huge stake in saying, hey, maybe alpha and beta blockers might work really well for ADHD. And again, I haven't done the research myself. I have not gone hands-on, nor will I ever go hands-on in this type of research. But I have read a lot of the literature, and it is intriguing. So just food for thought. It's always something that, and some people completely disagree. So just kind of interesting things to kind of play into what we're learning about here, especially with adolescence. So when puberty begins, we see some very specific physical things happening. First, gonadal changes happens. So the gonads actually produce the hormones and gametes in the individual. In females, the gonads are the ovaries, and in males, the testicles are the gonads. Testosterone is very highly associated with males, and it's because It is It is present in both males and females. It's secreted in a far greater amount in males than females, and this is information that I try to put things out there that will make sense to people. And one way to kind of think about the difference in testosterone in adolescence, when we look at things that are happening in culture today, one of the things where you might hear about testosterone is transgendered athletes. There's been a lot of talk about this with especially trans girls. So people who are biologically male but are transitioning and identify as girls, being placed or allowed to compete with female girls. Okay, this gets a little wordy and technical, but not technical. Female girls are XX chromosome, born with the biological sex of female. Transitional male XY girls are transgendered girls who actually have XY chromosomes, which would be male. If you look at, and there's a lot of research to show that testosterone does have a beneficial correlational, I don't know if it's correlational, causational, but there's a lot of, I'm going to just go correlational, benefit for athletes, bone density, muscle, fast twitch muscles, muscle mass, oxygen saturation within, the ability, I think it's VO2 max, I think is what it's called. I may be incorrect on that. But just to kind of look at the difference, an average female girl will have a testosterone level, I believe it's somewhere around like 60 to 80. And that's the number that they put towards, I can't remember what the milligram to whatever, but it's 60 to 80. And an average pubescent male boy has between 600 and 800 and could have as high as 1,000. So if you're looking at even the low end, a male, a transgendered girl, somebody who is biologically male but transgender and identifies as a girl, if not on any type of hormone treatment, they would have a 5 times, at minimum, a 5x amount of testosterone in their system. And even if they are on testosterone or hormone blockers, they still developed with a higher testosterone rate. Now, I am not an endocrinologist. I'm only basing this on the research that I've read, and I'm reading it from a psychological sexology perspective. There are some endocrinologists and some people in the gender studies world that will argue that has nothing to do with anything, that there's, there are some people who argue everything from once they go on testosterone blocking drugs and estrogen producing drugs, then the changes are in effect and there's really no difference from a competitive standpoint. There are some people who also, and I do disagree with this just from a basic fundamental biological perspective, but some people argue that there's no genetic difference whatsoever between males and females, that everything is a societal thing. I think that's a bridge too far for me. But I would be open to hearing what those people come to the table with. Usually those are not biologists who come to the table with that. Usually those are advocates, people who advocate for certain groups of people. But again, I can't say for certain, but I know that, just using law of parsimony, Occam's razor, that what I see is that, apples to apples, when you compare speed in the best males in the world and the best females in the world, if you look at the 100-meter dash world record, the pretty decent but not great college athletes and even high school athletes now, male athletes, are better than the world's record in female 100-meter dash. And that's not to say that there's not some advantages in athleticism in females. There most definitely are. But to say that when you look at powerlifting, when you look at strength, when you look at speed, when you look at endurance, there are every piece of evidence really points to the fact that there is something to testosterone, and simple fact that that using exorbitant amount of testosterone is illegal and against the rules for males. So it would make sense that testosterone does play a role in some of these things. But that's kind of an aside. Just to know that, testosterone is traditionally associated with male because males produce a higher amount. Estrogen, females produce more than males do. This does change later in life. We won't talk about this just yet, but men tend to produce more testosterone throughout their life than females, but females do later in life start to produce significantly more testosterone than they do during puberty. One thing that we have to remember is that the human, the meat machine, this carbon machine that we're all stuck in, our mind, if we want to go back to Psych 101 and talk about the dualism, that your mind and your body are inextricably linked, but they're still inextricably linked. Your mind is not working in opposition or devoid of contact with your body. And so body, brain, and behavior always interact, okay? Sometimes hormones are not going to cause emotions. Sometimes emotions are going to cause an increase or decrease in hormones. And it's very simple to try to explain away, young girls, young boys are just emotional or behaving in a certain way because they're hormonal. Well, sometimes they're hormonal because of the way that they're acting. And one thing that we have to remember as humans, as everybody here who is of college age, you are probably on the end of puberty, on the end of adolescence. And so we have to be mindful that sometimes we have, adolescents who are going through puberty and their body is telling them that they're adults, and we're treating them as children. And that's a very strange place to be when your body says, I'm ready. I'm an adult. I can do these things, and society and adults or parents or teachers or whoever are telling you, no, you're not ready to do that. That can be somewhat problematic. And so sometimes the behaviors actually increase or decrease, regulate, downgrade, upgrade the hormones that are being released. And so we have to be mindful not to just say that this is just because you're going through puberty. No, sometimes it's the way that the behavior occurs in interactions. So during this time, children are allowed to kind of do their own thing, and we start to see certain body rhythms occur. And the circadian rhythm is something that is put upon us. When I say that is we're kind of stuck on Earth until Elon Musk or somebody figures out a way that we're all going to become Martians, or going to go out to Europa, or just float around in space. And I'm not saying Elon Musk must do that for us, but he's somebody who's kind of putting it out there. We're kind of stuck on this Earth, and this Earth kind of gives us a 24.0 something, but it's 24-hour day. And that's called a circadian rhythm. Anybody who's had me before knows that I'm really big on Latin and Greek prefixes and roots. And circa means around, dia means day. So this is a circadian rhythm is around the day. It's a day-night cycle that happens approximately every 24 hours. So about or around a day. One thing that happens here during adolescence is that we have this bump in the need for REM sleep. So we have to go back to Psych 101, and we have to remember what REM sleep does for us. It gives us that really weird time where we're cataplectic, meaning that our muscles are limp except for our heart and lungs and things like that. And our eyes are going nuts, but also this is the point where growth hormones, the pituitary gland is very active, and growth hormones are being released. And so when we're in adolescence, when this is all happening, puberty, we're having these things called growth spurts. And if you've been around, you don't really see it when you're in it, but if you have nieces or nephews or children of your own, or you just see kids out in the community, or friends have kids and you see them and they're 12, and then you see them 6 months later and they've shot up 6 inches. And you're like, holy cow, what just happened? That was a growth spurt. And it tends to happen during the early to middle stages of puberty. And it's happening because of the culmination of increased pituitary activity, and if the child is getting enough sleep, then they'll have this growth spurt. Now, many of you have probably heard the old wives' tale or the old saying that coffee stunts your growth, okay? It is kind of a truism, because children who drink coffee during adolescence, and this is a little bit, I'm gonna kind of rephrase it here in a second, but if you think about a child who drinks coffee throughout the day, they may have trouble sleeping at night. They may not get the bump that they need in extra REM sleep, and so it's not going to significantly stunt their growth, but they may not have the same growth spurt that they were supposed to have because the pituitary gland and the REM sleep just doesn't happen. Let's come into the 21st century here. And I don't think that the problem is necessarily coffee, although it probably could be. I think the bigger issue is these gasoline-looking and smelling energy drinks that I hate to put brands out there, but Monster or 5 Hour Energy, or even sodas. Like I know I drink way too much of this. It's not a great thing, but that much caffeine in a 12 or 13-year-old, if they drank as much as I do, well, I guess if they have a tolerance to it, they probably wouldn't have any effect. But it can affect them if they start drinking at that time, and it's going to cause them not to be able to sleep as well and not to get into their REM cycles. So we have to be very careful with that, because that can really stunt growth. It really can. The old adage that coffee stunts growth, there is some validity to that. There is some science to that if they're not getting enough sleep, it's going to be a problem. There's another thing out there that's not chemical whatsoever, but it's actually something that I think that researchers in this field, I'm not raising my hand to do it, but I think researchers in this field really need to address, and that is cell phones. Cell phones, tablets, especially not just the fact that you can play games or anything, because that's been around forever. Kids have Nintendos and Segas. Okay, that's how old I am. PlayStations and Xboxes in their room. They've had books for as long as we've had books, and so kids could stay up and do stuff, or they could just talk all night. Not a big deal. But the intrusive nature of cell phones with getting messages all night, or posting something to social media and then going back and checking it to see if anybody has responded, that's very intrusive, and that is really causing an issue with sleep cycles. And just to give kind of a personal anecdote, my daughter, who is 9, had a young friend come over and spend the night one night this week, and my daughter does not have her own cell phone. She has a tablet, but it's a tablet that gets kind of taken away at night so that she doesn't have that going on, trying to keep things modulated somewhat. She can message her friends, but she has to use, somebody else's phone. So if she wants to use something, it's somewhat regulated. But her friend had just her own phone, own plan, and they beat me in staying up all night. And I think that found out later that they were watching YouTube videos, and I don't think anything nefarious was going on, but that night definitely they did not get enough sleep for how old they are, between 9 and 10. So something that really needs to be looked at, because that phone there's apps that are designed to get you to constantly pick it up, messengers, things of that nature. So we have to be very careful, especially with our young adolescent children, that they are getting enough sleep. And to tell a child around 10 years old, hey, give me your cell phone because you need more sleep, immediately they're going to say they don't need much sleep, and secondarily try to take that phone away after they've gotten it attached surgically to that hand. It's good luck. That's all I have to say. So we look at these people in high school, whether or not they're getting at least 8 hours of sleep, and lo and behold, not a single grouping here, boys or girls, are getting 50% are getting at least 8 hours of sleep. Okay, and then you get up to 12th grade, the 17 to 18-year-olds, and less than 25% are getting 8 hours or more of sleep per night. What's going on there? Again, I can throw out a whole bunch of hypotheses, but this doesn't explain what's going on. So one hypothesis might be that our 12th graders getting too much homework? Are cell phones interfering with their sleep? Do they have too much extracurriculars going on. These are all hypotheses that if you are interested in this field, you could do that research. You could do that research by yourself. And literally it could be a valid and reliable study. If you ask 100 students at a school, or if you if you teach Sunday school, or you are your assistant coach, or you just have a group of kids around you, if you ask them, do you get this amount of sleep, and then ask them, give them 4 different options. You don't want to lead them, but ask them why, and you could add to the scientific discussion of your research would be very narrow in scope. You would be cell phone usage of 12th graders at Valparaiso High School, and its effect on nightly hours of sleep. I mean, you would think that is too narrow of a research topic to be of interest, but those micro studies are actually invaluable to larger meta-analyses. So a lot of times people think that, if I'm going to do research in any field, it has to be this huge thing. No, sometimes if we just take a small population and we find out an answer to that, and then if 15 other people throughout the United States each did the exact same thing, then we could do a meta-analysis, and then all of a sudden we have a bigger answer to something, and that's how science goes. It's not a guessing game. It's not just one person sitting in an ivory tower, doing research. A lot of this is very collaborative, and we, as scientists, and I'm counting all of you in on this. You are a scientist. If you are in my psych course, you are a scientist, because we are asking questions and making scientific inquiries on these things. If you're interested, if you want to know why these things are, just start finding out. You may actually find out that people in Valparaiso are vastly different than, again, I'm going to stick with this, the other 15 research, small researchers who do this. If you were to do a meta-analysis and compare yours against the other 15, you may find out, wow, everybody else came up with a different reason for why these 12th graders are not getting enough sleep. But guess what? It's still valid, and it's still valuable, because did you do anything wrong in your study? That's the first thing you have to ask yourself is, did I do my study wrong? But if you didn't, then you can actually affect change on this group in Valparaiso, because maybe they're different. Not everybody's going to be the same. So this is so incredibly invaluable that researchers, that everybody figure out what the scientific method is, and everybody throw information into the pot. And if you're different than everybody else, don't become territorial and say, wait a second, those other 15 are completely wrong. My research was right because I did it correctly. No, say, okay, yeah, those other 15, that's why most people that's why most 12th graders are not getting enough sleep. But in Valparaiso, Indiana, something else is happening, and we need to address this other thing. Could be that something in Valparaiso is completely unique. I don't know what that would be, but that's what science is for. That's what the hypothesis is all about. So science, as you can tell, science is near and dear to my heart, and I want all of you to be scientific in the way that you think about things, and don't just accept what you hear on the news or what you hear from researchers, because sometimes if it doesn't make sense to you, it could be because you're a part of a group that it doesn't make sense to, and that's perfectly fine. So moving forward, we have this argument that comes out of your textbook, Berger I think it's 3rd edition. There's been a lot of research and a lot of schools that are actually taking this to heart, saying that high schools should not begin their classes until at least 8:30 or 9, and some of them actually push for 10 o'clock. I know some schools will start as early as 7 a.m. I think my high school, we started at 8:05. And I can't remember exactly because it's just when school started. So I never really quite knew if this was, nature, nurture, whether I had to be. But I can remember that it was some of the morning classes were harder because I just wasn't going. And when you get to the college and university level, especially on a campus where you actually live there, so if you live in the dorms and you schedule yourself, most people did not want to schedule themselves for 7 or 8 a.m. classes. The fight normally was for 9 and 10 and sometimes 1 o'clock classes. Got you done early at the end of the day, but also the idea of rolling out of bed at 7, showering, and getting to class by 8 and being alert, especially for something that's cognitively taxing like algebra or physics or science or psychology, wink wink, it was hard to get your mind going. So sometimes if the schools can't change the start time, if they have to because of busing or because of the community, they have to have an earlier start time. A lot of researchers have pointed out the fact that you can introduce like physical education to the older students early in the morning, because that will not only, it doesn't really take cognitive stress, it doesn't really take a lot of thought, but it also will get them moving and get them going, which will actually help them, wake them up. Or putting them into less cognitively stressing classes in the morning and then putting them into more cognitively stressing ones in the afternoon. But again, remember, everybody's different. Some of you who are listening or watching this are morning birds, and to you, I say, what is wrong with you? There's nothing pleasant about the morning, although sometimes accidentally wake up early and it is okay. But the thought of going into algebra at 7 a.m., the thought of going into algebra right now is not a pleasant thought to begin with, but going in at 7 a.m., I just don't feel like I could conquer it the way that I would need to. So there's a lot of research. Again, research on this is forthcoming. Nothing is a settled science. We also know that sometimes we see, especially in older students, we see them falling asleep in school, and they report that they're too tired to exercise. These are coming from the Sleep Foundation. So obviously they're going to be a bit skewed, and they're going to say, they're not getting enough sleep, they're not getting enough quality sleep. There's something else here. And again, this is a hypothesis, but I'm going to stand by this hypothesis that I don't need to do the research to really think that this is founded. And I know that that's not really scientific. But I think a lot of this also has to do with nutrition. And so my hypothesis would be poor nutrition is actually leading to children falling asleep in school and they're too tired to exercise. Unfortunately, a lot of times we see younger people trying to regulate themselves with things like caffeine and sugar rather than, just healthy foods. If you look at the average or a potential normal breakfast, if you're putting cereal in front of a high schooler, you're basically just pumping sugar in front of them with a little bit of protein from the milk. It's just sugar rush and then crash, and that's why I'm not going to say that it's all about nutrition, because I can remember being in high school. I know I have students sitting in front of me in my morning classes, and when they fall asleep, I don't blame it on their sleep patterns. I don't blame it on nutrition. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes I'm just not engaging. Sometimes I'm just rambling on. I know it's amazing to think about, but I know that sometimes it's not. It's just the content isn't all that interesting, and especially in high school where you're kind of forced into classes that you have no interest in. That may be one of the major causes of being too tired to sleep, or too tired in school when you're falling asleep. So there's a lot of different hypotheses here, but honestly, it's very intriguing to kind of hopefully understand what's going on here. And now we're going to get back into gender. Okay? This is, again, based upon the research and the science that we have today. For anyone who hears this and disagrees because they've seen anecdotal evidence or they've heard people lecture about gender and genetics, I would strongly encourage you not to discount and not to dismiss anything that you've read or seen, but always follow up on where people get their information, okay? If people are saying stuff about gender and genetics because that's what they've experienced, that's their personal experience. And this is a term that I do not like, but I will put it out there because it's something that is heard quite a bit. Personal truth or your truth. I struggle with that as a scientist because there is truth and then there's truth and then there's truth. But personal truth is basically a subjective experience or interpretation, and in science we don't put a lot of credence towards that. So we're going to be sticking to developmental research. Some of it is older research, and we still hold on to it. And a lot of people say, well, because it's old, it's got to be wrong. It's not necessarily wrong. It may not be completely compatible with how we see things from a social perspective, from a politically correct perspective, but this is the best research that we have right now, and it tends to hold steady when tested and retested within the scientific community. So when we look at variation in the age of puberty, it's usually genetic, meaning that if we look at mom and dad's age of puberty, we can kind of predict, usually if it's going to do anything, it's going to be at a younger age, but it's going to be something that, siblings, nature, nurture, all things being equal, the variation in age of puberty is genetic. The sex chromosomes, the 22nd pairing, the XX or XY, also have a very marked effect on the age of puberty. Girls tend to develop ahead of boys, and children with a large proportion of body fat experience puberty sooner than their thin contemporaries. And then there's a lot of things going on here. One being that with more fat deposits in the body, there's a more opportunity for faster maturation. We also know that sometimes these fatty deposits are indicative of certain types of diets that may be high in fat or high in carbohydrates. It may also come from hormone-laced beef or chicken, any type of food. So there's a correlation there. Again, I don't know that research has shown the causal effect, but we do know that there's a high correlation there. So when we're looking at this, hormone affects appetite is believed to be involved in the onset of puberty. So in both sexes or both genders, because again, at this point, we're still looking at sex and gender being completely different terms, but inextricably somewhat linked. In a majority of the population, there are people where sex and gender are not linked, but in a majority of the population it is. We see that malnutrition delays puberty. And so we don't just look at, third world countries or underdeveloped countries is what they're called contemporarily. We see puberty being delayed quite frequently in where they don't have good quality foods, but also we see it here in the United States. And I'm gonna tread lightly on this, but because it's not universal. But I can remember when I was high school, college age, the women's gymnastics, our women's gymnastics teams were incredibly talented, and they were doing incredibly well on the world stage. And you would watch these young ladies, and they would be 16, 17, 18, and they would interview these individuals, these young ladies, these very talented gymnasts later on in life. And one of the things that almost to a T they would talk about was the thing that they sacrificed was their diet. They would be on diets that would be devoid of protein, would be devoid of meats, would be devoid of certain dairies. And the whole purpose of it was to create a pseudo malnutrition where they would delay menarche. And so these 16, 17, 18-year-old gymnasts would, because they had such low body fats, they would be tiny. They would be under 5 foot and weighing maybe 80 or 90 pounds. They were developmentally strong. They had to be incredibly strong and fast, and they could jump. Incredibly strong and great athletes, but they would be, and I don't want to make this sound nefarious as what it may come across, but they were being artificially held back from puberty so that they didn't have their growth spurt, so that they didn't have sometimes the extra fatty deposits that happens after puberty. And so that is kind of a weird chronic malnutrition that when you look at them, they're Olympic athletes, you think, wait a second, there's no malnutrition going on there. Look at them. They're working out all day. Well, they're giving them foods that are going to stunt development. Not nefarious, not Dr. Evil type of thing, but just realistically, these things did happen with these young females. So again, getting back to when psychosexually, we see menarche and spermarchy for females and males. Puberty onset happens, between the ages of 10 to 11 or 12. We see a rise in hormone levels. We can see these as young as 8. That's not the bottom. We've seen it lower than that, or as old as 14, and that is developmentally 8 to 14 is what is now kind of considered the normal time. If somebody's 15 or 16, it's not that it's a horrible bad thing, but it is considered to be abnormal, as is 7 or 6. Because it's outside of the statistical range of what we should be seeing. It's also sometimes a little bit too early or a little bit too late for regular puberty onset. Now, I am going to take a little aside here. I'm not going to go deep into this, but there are some endocrinologists, some developmental pediatricians, some developmental physicians who are working with individuals who identify as transgendered or potentially transgender. So they're not identifying, but they're identifying as questioning. And so there are some doctors who are advocating for puberty blockers. So basically hormone blockers that will allow the young person to develop without hitting puberty, which will, as kind of phenotypically, will stop all the traditional visible indicators of puberty. So for young females who may be questioning their gender, it stops the development of breast, secondary sex characteristics such as breast, and things that we associate with puberty. For young men, they won't hit puberty, so they won't go through the voice change or other secondary sex characteristics that are going to happen during that time. The research is still very vague, and if you're hearing this and you're appalled that I'm saying that the research is vague, it's probably because you've listened to people who are advocating one way or the other, and if you are staunchly against this, you're going to look at the vague research or just the thought process that this is not a good thing and kind of hold it up and say, no, this is a horrible thing. And then if you're an advocate for, this puberty blocking that will allow young children to make a better decision without the ramifications of puberty, you'll probably say, well, this is obviously the best thing for that individual. And the simple answer is we don't know. We don't know if delaying puberty. We know that normal puberty that happens after 14 is not optimal, but it doesn't really harm that much. But how long can we hold off puberty before it actually does create a problem? Or will it never create a problem? Could somebody stay on puberty blockers indefinitely? Could we see people at the age of 30 coming off of hormone blockers? I'm not sure. I don't know, but I do know that anybody who can sit and tell you explicitly one way or the other is extrapolating information from research that I don't know that they should be, because we haven't seen it, to my knowledge. We haven't held somebody on puberty blockers for an extended period of time. And even if we have, those are anecdotal pieces of evidence. They're not double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, which are going to be very difficult to do on humans anyway, because there's institutional review board issues there out the wazoo. I'm not saying not to do it. I'm just saying that most of the time when you're hearing people make definitive statements about these topics that are very new, they've been in the periphery in culture for quite a while, but they're relatively new in regards to kind of a national discussion. So just be mindful that when you read or hear somebody talking, again, scientifically speaking, you should always check the source material to make sure that you're hearing the right things. So when we look at generational secular trends, the data on puberty over the centuries reveals that things have been up and down throughout generations. Each generation experienced puberty slightly earlier, slightly later, but usually we're moving backwards. In developed nations, we're starting to see that this trend has slowed or even stopped. And I think that we've gotten to a point of critical mass where I don't know that the human body can go back much further in puberty. We can't have children at the age of 5 hitting puberty. It's just, the body just is not ready for that. So we're starting to see that in more developed nations, what we used to call first world nations, this trend has kind of slowed. But when we look at developing nations or what we used to call third world nations, we tend to see this go up and down based upon the socioeconomic aspects of what is happening in that particular culture. We also know that stress will bring about the onset of puberty. So we tend to see there's a high correlation between divorce or stressful family situations and earlier puberty. Sexual abuse will lead, a lot of times correlationally, we think correlationally, a little bit causally, to earlier puberty. And most people who study this pretty much think that it is cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone, that the more cortisol that kind of comes out, there's going to be a correlation in puberty beginning a little bit earlier. There's other factors to be certain, but that's one of the major reasons that we think it's cortisol that's triggering puberty. We don't know what it means to be too early or too late. We do know that early maturing girls, when we do cross-sectional analyses, tend to have lower self-esteem, more depression, and poorer body image than later maturing girls. I would tend to think that this is a social issue, that early maturing girls are kind of stick out in their cohort as, you know, as everybody else is not maturing, maybe a few are maturing, and so they are critiqued more, or they are, just to be brutally honest, you know, they are seen as older and more mature, and so but they're socially not as mature, so they may be in the wrong social groups. And maybe an older group is trying to bring them in because they might look older, and there becomes a problem that they're not socially mature enough for that. Early maturing boys, on the other hand, tend to be more aggressive and tend to be have conduct-related issues. Again, we're not sure why that is, but one statistical theory is that because we know that the age of onset of puberty tends to be highly correlated with genetic features. If dad and mom were both early maturers, they may have actually been more apt to have children at a younger age. Not necessarily saying that that's always going to happen, but sometimes that may be occurring, and so that personality trait or tendency of heredity may be passed along with the early maturing, early onset of puberty males. Again, not saying that there's a causal link there, but there may be a correlational link there. We've already talked about the growth spurt, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. We know that each body part increases in size on a schedule, so sometimes you'll see kids in puberty that, you know, a lot of times we'll see them have trouble with coordination, things of that nature, and it's because some parts of the body are growing faster than others. Sometimes we'll see kids that get really lanky, and then their torso catches up with them. Sometimes we'll see fat deposits start to develop in different parts of the body quicker than others, and so children at this time are kind of just, it's an awkward phase both emotionally and socially, but also physically, because things are changing very quickly, and the person has to adapt to it very quickly. Lungs will triple in weight. So adolescents will, as their body is smaller but their lungs are huge proportionally, they'll tend to breathe more slowly and deeply. The heartbeat will slow, so it's not uncommon for a child who has a fast heartbeat. Most children before puberty do have a very fast heartbeat. The heart doubles in size during adolescence, so it starts to slow down, but it's increasing blood pressure. Only the lymph node system decreases in size, and that's the tonsils and adenoids. Fortunately, teenagers are less susceptible to respiratory ailments, and I know when I was growing up, I had asthmatic symptoms. I was very frequently had upper respiratory infections. My daughter, who is 9, prepubescent, she has a lot of respiratory issues, asthma, and just trouble with breathing issues with different atmospheres, when it's humid, when it's cold, and when she exercises. So the hope is, I kind of grew out of it, so I'm kind of hoping that she grows out of it a little bit. She may continue to have respiratory ailments her entire life, but fingers crossed, that's one of the things. I've been very lucky with my daughter, but really hope that maybe that's one thing that she can grow out of. During this time, we're going to start to talk, and we're going to hit some buttons with some people, because you may have come out of puberty pretty recently. For me, it's a little bit further back, and for some of you, it may be further back, but, we can still empathize. Skin becomes oilier, sweatier, more prone to acne. Hair on the head and limbs become coarse and darker, so a lot of kids who have, blonde hair or lightish brown hair will start to darken up their hair. They start to develop new hair under the arm, on the faces, and over the external sex organs. Hair growth is more than a growth characteristics. It's actually a display of sexuality. So I'll be the first to admit that when I was 16 or 17, I had the world's worst goatee. It was definitely a peach fuzz goatee with about 4 little whiskers in it. No amount of ridicule from friends and girls was going to make me shave that thing, but finally when I shaved it, started to realize that, it wasn't really anything but peach fuzz. And that happens at a lot of different stages of life. I mean, for some people, that they'll never be able to grow a beard. For some females, their legs, and males, their legs never become really coarse, and hair becomes dense. But we do start to see, growth on the secondary or on the primary sex organs, and the face for males, sometimes females, and under the arms, very natural during puberty. The primary sex characteristics versus secondary, I've used this term kind of interchangeably throughout this lecture. Hopefully it was not something that was too confusing, but let me give you the definitions now. The primary sex characteristics are the ones that are directly involved with reproduction. So easy way to remember this, primary sex characteristics are ones that are covered by lower bathing suits, okay? So for a female, the top of the bathing suit, if it's a bikini, only the bottoms are going to be covering the primary sex characteristics. So the vagina, the uterus, the ovaries, the testicles. For the males, the testicles and penis, those are going to be covered by a swimsuit. Secondary sex characteristics are the things that we associate with males and females. So again, I'm using that term very specifically, XX, XY, males and females. So women's breast, men's beard, Adam's apple, secondary sex characteristics, I would also put in there possibly like hair on a male's chest and back, maybe a secondary sex characteristic. But those are things that indicate sexual maturity. And then there's other things that we can pretty much put in there as well, like the deepening of the voice is a secondary sex characteristic. You can usually tell, and I'm going to try to keep this as PG as possible without making myself sound, if anybody edits this, like I'm a complete creep. But you can, if you're listening to someone's voice, if you're listening to a young male's voice, you can usually tell by the tone and sometimes the volume whether they are sexually mature or sexually immature. Young males, young boys have a much higher voice, but then when they hit puberty, the voice tends to lower. And in that intermixed time where they're transitioning, you have that beautiful sound of the cracking voice, where the voice is sometimes deep like Barry White, but then you get a little bit of Prince in there when the voice cracks. Girls have that just a little bit, but not nearly as much. So those are secondary sex characteristics that we associate with sex, but they aren't primary sex characteristics. Primary sex characteristics are things that are correlated and to an extent causally influenced and more correlated with the XX chromosomes, would be the vagina, uterus, ovaries, and the XY chromosomes, testicles, and penis. When nutrients are missing, there can be some pretty significant results that come from that. this number I think is significantly low. The 16% number that high school seniors eat recommended vegetable servings. I'm sorry, that's backwards. I read that backwards. Only 16%. Yeah, I think that's probably about right. What can happen if you don't have the right nutrients, the right vitamins that come from food is that there's concentration issues, there's athletic issues, there's for females, there's menstruation issues. One thing that a lot of younger females tend to have, and young adults, they tend to have an iron deficiency called anemia. This is something that should be discussed and diagnosed by a physician, and especially if it's a male thinking that there's some kind of iron deficiency, because again, I'm not talking about prescribing or diagnosing anything, but there can be some pretty significant issues if a male, especially a pubescent male, takes an excess of iron that they don't have a deficiency. That's one of those times where you should really be checking with your physician about any type of supplements or vitamins that you're taking or your children are taking, because there can be such a significant issue there. This is also a huge time where body dissatisfaction comes in. Let's be brutally honest. If you're looking at pubescent boys and girls, most of them are not going to like their body. They're going to see something wrong with their body. They're constantly either going to want to be improving it, or they're going to be thinking negatively about it. Girls are looking at changes in their body and body dissatisfaction because the notion, the correlation that there is a belief that boys tend to prefer to date thin girls. And I'm not going to sit here and debate the social construct of what boys like and what boys don't like, but that is the perception of why girls tend to claim that they need to diet or change their body image. Boys want to look taller and stronger because, again, we're going back to older research, but I still say that this holds true. We may need to change some of the nouns and some of the pronouns, but boys want to look taller and stronger partly because girls value well-developed muscles in males. I think one of the first steps I could change here is boys want to look taller and stronger because potential mates value well-developed muscles in males. Okay, so that really takes off the one of the major equations of heterosexuals versus homosexuals. I think that's one thing that is valued. And again, not by everybody. Not everybody values a well-developed, muscular, or fit male. But this is kind of the overarching paradigm. So that may not be what anybody in particular is looking at, but in the law of large numbers, that tends to be what most individuals report. And so we can't put in what every person's ideal person would look like or potential mate would look like. We can't do that. But we can look at what the statistics tell us, which sometimes does not match up with you. So that's okay. If you don't like a male who's well developed, or you don't like a girl who is thin, you are not abnormal in any way. That is personal preference. That's subjectivity. But when we look at large groups of populations, we have to look at what the majority are looking at, and what research tends to show is that this is a preference. And then if you want to get into the sociological debate of why that occurs, take it up in sociology. We know that obesity is a problem in adolescence. Rates are falling in childhood because there's such a push for appropriate nutrition in children, but it's rising in adolescence. 15% of students in 22 states were obese. That is significantly lower than adult rates, but if you think about it, it's much more difficult for an adolescent to become obese because, A, they should be a little bit more active, they have more energy, but secondly, they're going through growth spurts, and that weight should be redistributed. And so that number is somewhat jarring. The answer, however, is not to take in artificial stimulants or drugs, especially diet pills, to lose weight or to go on crash diets. And it sure as heck isn't taking steroids or testosterone or anything, because usually what's going to happen for these, if you look at testosterone, the average young male in adolescence has more than enough. They have an excess. So, yeah, it can lead to some positive body morphic issues, but it's going to cause a huge problem later on in life for those individuals. When we get into the psychopathology issue, one of the things that happens during adolescence that we don't see in younger stages is anorexia nervosa. I talk about this very extensively in Psych 205, so if this is the moment you've been waiting for in this discussion, I would encourage you to enroll in Psych 205 soon, because we do talk about the disorders much more in depth at that point. Anorexia nervosa is it's usually comorbid with body dysmorphic disorder, where an individual looks at themselves and they see an incorrect, they perceive an incorrect interpretation of what their body actually looks like. So if they look in the mirror, their eyes are perfectly fine. They're seeing everything perfectly fine, but then the occipital lobe and the visual cortex is playing a trick on them, and it's making them see, or perceive is a better term. In anorexia nervosa, they're going to see somebody who is fat. And so one thing that you just can't do with somebody with anorexia nervosa is look at them and say, my God, you're skin and bones, you're so skinny. And they look at you and they say, no, I'm fat. I mean, I have fat all over my body. Because when they look in the mirror, they actually are seeing it. They're perceiving it. And that's the scary thing, because, they're not seeing that they are skin and bones, and, ribs are sticking out. Sometimes anorexia, there's exercise bulimia, which is a different thing altogether. Bulimia is where a person binges and purges. Anorexia, they tend to be meticulous about the amount of food they take in, sometimes as little as like 300 or 400 calories a day, sometimes even less, in hopes of decreasing their weight. And at some point, when the body no longer has muscle, no longer has fat to get rid of, it's going to start depleting the internal organs. And so this is a very, very serious and very deadly issue. And it's not just a matter of pumping calories into these individuals. It's a matter of making sure that they get appropriate treatment for this disorder. So bulimia is actually a lot of times people think that they're interchangeable. They're very different. They have the same issue where it's an internal desire to change the structure of the body. But bulimia is an eating disorder where there's binging and then purging, which is either through laxatives or vomiting. It's about 3 times more likely in females than males. But there are certain groups that we have to be very mindful of, where they don't see it as bulimia, and it doesn't really fit the clinical definition of bulimia, but from a functional perspective, it's bulimia. Specifically, things like wrestlers, high school wrestlers, if they're trying to make weight, if they normally walk around at 180 pounds, but they want to wrestle at 155 because they think that they have an advantage there. They're going to artificially try to drop their weight, sometimes through sweating, sometimes through laxatives, sometimes through vomiting, sometimes it's usually not through caloric restriction, because unfortunately, they need the calories for the energy. So sometimes they will go on hydration diets where they will go for a day or two and not drink anything. They'll drop a ton of poundage, which is water weight. And then unfortunately, though, one of the major places where if you stop drinking, one of the places that first starts to lose hydration is the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood and hydration of the brain, which can lead to some pretty significant issues. So again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this, but I do follow this, especially, there's been a lot of talk in the world of professional fighting, like mixed martial arts, UFC, if anybody's, interested in those sports. They have been long talking about changing the way that people cut weight, because it is not uncommon for somebody to cut upwards of 30 pounds or 40 pounds to fight at a different weight. And it is I don't want to glorify it, but it is a skill for people to be able to do that. You have people who walk around and train at 245 and they cut down to 205. But by the time, they weigh in the day before a fight, and then the next day they've hydrated themselves and they're back up to like 240. So technically, two people fighting at 205, one could naturally be at 205, the other could be dehydrated, and they rehydrate and they put on, 20 or 30 pounds. They use IVs, and they're not really in the same weight class. So very much an aside. I do apologize, but that is really, in my opinion, a derivative of bulimia nervosa. It's just something that has a different goal behind it. And then binge eating disorders. These are people that tend not to purge afterwards, but binge eating is where you normally secretly will eat large amounts of food until their stomach is actually in pain. A lot of times this is a control mechanism. It's not necessarily has anything to do with body image. And they don't. The significant change here is binge eating is just where the eating occurs, but there's no purging. So a lot of times this is comorbid with depression, and we see that quite frequently. Last thing I want to cover here is the way that the brain develops, because there's different parts of the brain and they grow at different rates. To begin with, the limbic system matures before the prefrontal cortex. So the limbic system includes things like the amygdala that regulates the emotional responses and fear, and that's going to mature before the prefrontal cortex. And so we tend to see, especially with males, but this happens with females as well, that because the limbic system is developed before the frontal lobe, that aggression happens during the early stages of puberty. And that's because younger children will tend to younger adolescents who have just hit puberty, their frontal lobe has not developed to say, hey, this is the ramification. If you do this, if you aggressively act out, there's going to be a consequence. If the frontal lobe hasn't completely matured and isn't quite there yet, they're going to be basing what they do on the limbic system, which is fight or flight or freeze. And so they don't think about the potential ramifications, and a lot of times we see aggression, and we also see uncontrollable fear. So it's not uncommon for early adolescents to experience more fear and anxiety than when the matured brain has finally developed. So if we look at this, we look at a person's development of gray matter, and you can see that towards the age of 20, we start to develop almost fully formed cortical surface of gray matter. But if we look at the age of 5 and we look kind of here at around when puberty starts, which is about this third brain right here, we can see that the frontal lobe, look down here at the third brain at the bottom, where it's a top view, a lot of the frontal cortex is not developed with gray matter. So obviously there's going to be some issues in early maturation where that frontal lobe is going to be less than optimized. And so we see by the age of about 20, it's still not perfectly covered with gray matter. And so there's not as good maturation. The gray matter is there, but it's not mature gray matter. So it's not like we're growing additional gray matter, but it's not functional, especially if you look back here, the age of 5 to 10-ish, there's a lot of red, which means there's just not much at all there. But then as we get to about 20, we see that the gray matter has matured. We still have a few areas that need to mature because the frontal lobe does not fully develop until about the age of 22 to 25. For some people, 30, 40, sometimes 60. That's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but some people do mature much later than others. This slower rate of maturity in the frontal lobe means that logic is not something that should be expected during adolescence. This is one reason why when you have especially things that are regulated by the amygdala and the limbic system, when they are very strong, when those emotional things are going very strong for adolescents, they tend not to be able to think very well. And I can think back to when I was a teenager and my frontal lobe was definitely not developed. When there was a fight or flight response, or if there was the other thing the amygdala controls somewhat is the fourth F. So there's fight, fright, freeze, and fornication. So when sexual development was occurring, the amygdala is firing off things, and the frontal lobe just wasn't there to say, hey, you know what, you have curfew, or you need to be responsible about certain things. Adolescent individuals don't think things through as much as adults should. I say should. I'm not saying that all adults are perfect about that, but just there is a logic shut down there. We know that pleasure is something that adolescents seek out because they're getting the thrill of new sensations. However, impulsivity tends to slow down with maturation, and part of that is the fact that dopamine, the anticipation that the good feeling you get about anticipating something happening from dopamine is somewhat downregulated as you get older, but also you become more satiated, and it's not as powerful as it is as a younger person. The other thing is sensation seeking and thrills are something that we kind of attribute to the lack of maturity of the frontal lobe. And in the documentary series that I assigned for Psych 201 Lifespan Development, one of them, The Secret Life of the Brain, they show a younger driver in a racing type career, not necessarily a career, but activity, where they're doing dirt track or short track racing, and younger individuals tend to be somewhat more successful than older drivers. And one of the theories behind that is because their frontal lobe isn't quite developed, so they're more apt to take a chance. They might impulsively try to pass somebody or do something where an older adult might be, their frontal lobe is thinking things through and saying, well, that's not a good idea. But the younger person is just like, I'm going to do this. It's sensation seeking. It's impulsive. It's thrill seeking. And we tend to see that tends to kind of go down after adolescence or after puberty. And when somebody's in their early 20s, we tend to see that go down quite significantly. The benefits of these developments as the adolescent becomes more closer to adulthood, we see increased myelination, which means that the myelination of the axon and the axon terminals for the neuron means that you're going to have increased reaction time. So you're going to be able to respond to things quicker because the myelination actually holds the information for things like muscle memory. We actually have more positive neurotransmitters in the adolescent brain. So even though sometimes those neurotransmitters are going to cause a problem because of impulsivity, it's still better because the adolescent has the opportunity to have those positive experiences. And synaptic growth, which means there's synaptic pruning, but also synaptic growth, where we're going to see a better development of morality and the ability to be able to think about new experiences rather than doing the same thing over and over. One thing that I've read research about that I find to be very intriguing and kind of telling here is that during childhood and pre-puberty, it is very common for children to enjoy watching the same TV show, the same movies, that read the same books, hear the same stories over and over and over. They like the repetition. Whereas when adolescents start to hit, or when a child becomes an adolescent, they tend to want to branch out and see new things, or they want to listen to new music, or they want to watch different movies and different TV shows, and that's because of the synaptic growth, that they have the ability to really understand these different neural pathways, and they can compare and contrast things that children really can't do because of their the synaptic growth hasn't happened just yet. So very interesting to kind of see that the thinking patterns are changing, and usually for the better. So we kind of come around full circle. We start talking about the developmental psychologist from yesteryear that we're going to try to associate with these different stages of life. Primarily, we're going to look at Piaget here. This is the fourth and final stage of cognitive development, and now we're thinking logically. So according to Piaget, we can finally start to think about abstract ideas, which is very, very important. Formal operation means I can now not only think about things from my memory, things that I've experienced, but I can also start to use my theory of mind, that I can understand what you're thinking and I understand that you understand what I'm thinking, and then going down that rabbit hole. And also we can introduce abstract ideas. And those abstract ideas are something that a person can think about. They can actually think about the possible implications of a thought or a behavior, irregardless of whether they've experienced it before. So they can actually think about, if I do this, there may be a novel result to it, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but they can make decisions based upon that. Assumptions, according to Piaget, that have no necessary relation to reality. We know that adolescents have a new form of egocentrism. Now, this isn't the egocentrism from early childhood where they literally think the world revolves around them and they can't grasp things like a daughter cannot look at, so my daughter could not look at, in early childhood with egocentrism, could not look at my mother and say, that's your mom, Dad. No, she would say, that's Grandma. And I'd say, oh, that's also my mom. And no, that's Grandma. That's egocentrism. Egocentrism here is basically that what happens to me is the only thing that matters. There's the invincibility fable. And that's basically, if you look at the word fable, what they're saying here is it's the false belief, the personal fable. So who you are, who you think you are, who you think you are in comparison to other people. The invincibility fable that, hey, if you ask a kid, they're going to live forever. And the imaginary audience, that they are constantly being watched, that they're constantly there's a perception of what they're doing, even if no one's around. They are very mindful of the fact that maybe that there could be an audience, but they have an imaginary audience around them constantly, which is developmentally. One theory behind, or one hypothesis behind this, is that they're trying out different personas, different activities, and seeing in their mind, kind of play acting how people might respond, the audience might respond. So it's not necessarily psychosis, imaginary audience, but basically trying on different things. And so we look at Piaget's early experiment, and you should have read about this in the textbook. If you look at why these things are happening, the A and B, these young people don't understand why these things are happening. They don't understand basic physics, but C and D, we look at these individuals, B and C don't necessarily understand how things are going, but if we look at A and D, they do tend to see why these things are happening. And it's basically looking at, not necessarily that they understand physics any better or chemistry any better, but they understand the logic behind certain thought experiments or physical experiments that could be happening. So the last thing we'll look at here from cognitive development is deductive and inductive reasoning and hypothetical thought. So I'm going to start with the third one, hypothetical thought. And this gets back to Piaget's notion that adolescents can be logical, so that they look at propositions and possibilities that may not be reality, but they reflect a potential reality. So hypothetical thought is, if I do X, then Y may happen. They're basing it on reality, but not necessarily the reality that they're in. Okay. The other thing is deductive and inductive reasoning, and this is is something that a lot of people get mixed up. Even people who study philosophy and study psychology and sociology. And so this is one of those things that I want to end with, because I think it's something that you can take away from this lecture. I hope you take away everything from this lecture as incredibly important, but I think this is one that will actually pay dividends in many different areas. Deductive reasoning is reasoning from a general statement. So you deduce from a general statement. So it's a top-down reasoning, okay? I get a premise, and then I say, therefore, this thing happens or exists. So if I make a deductive reasoning of I must get my bachelor's before I can get my master's, I must get my master's before I get my doctorate. Okay? Deductive reasoning would say I must get my bachelor's before my doctorate. Nothing was said about that, but I could deduce. I could take down the information and say A happens before B, B happens before C, therefore A must happen before C. Okay? Inductive reasoning is reasoning from one or more specific experiences, or bottom-up reasoning. And this is a lot of times where scientific or personal anecdotes are put in place of what would be a rational scientific deduction. So inductive reasoning would be where we get biases, where we get racism, where we get bigotry. I met a person with this particular characteristic and I did not like them, therefore I do not like anybody with this particular characteristic. I dated a girl over 6 feet and we didn't work out, so I will never date a person over 6 feet again. Okay, do you see where inductive reasoning? It's how we work sometimes, but it's not necessarily always going to work out well for us. Something like I like movies that star Will Smith. Okay, and so I guarantee I'm going to like the new Aladdin movie. Maybe I'm not. Or even a little bit more bizarre. I liked Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, when he was a pro wrestler for WWE. Therefore, I will like him as an actor. That's inductive reasoning, because I took two things. I like this person, and now this person is an actor. Therefore, I will like this person as an actor. That's inductive. It's not necessarily always going to hold true. Sometimes it's a shortcut. Like, I liked Fast and the Furious 1, therefore I will probably like Fast and the Furious 2. If I put that possibly in there, if I put that maybe in there, that's inductive reasoning that could work, because most people who like the first one like the second one. So inductive reasoning sometimes is a heuristic. It's a shortcut, a cognitive shortcut, but deductive reasoning is almost always going to be correct. Inductive reasoning, not necessarily. Okay? All right. So that brings me to the end of this lecture about adolescence. This was a little bit longer than I normally go, and I do apologize, and yet I don't, because this is really important in lifespan development. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, anything of that nature, please email me, text me, hit me up on Twitter or wherever you want to find me. Good luck finding me in some situations, but that's okay. If you have specific questions, you can always email me, bmitchell@ivytech.edu, or you can make a comment to this video directly. I don't necessarily always check those as quickly, but you can definitely get a hold of me. So until next time, thank you for your attention, and I hope that this lecture has been helpful for you in understanding adolescence and lifespan development.